ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your patience. I'm Steve Erlanger with the New York Times, and I have the great pleasure to have this discussion with an old friend, Chrystia Freeland, who has had an amazing career. First as a journalist. We met when you were a stringer for the FT in Kiev, by the way.
And was it still the Soviet Union? I think it may have been.
And you were a little smoker and everything?
Yes, that's actually true. Don't tell my secrets here. My kids will get mad at me.
I know.
They're part of the neo-Puritan generation.
And then you came to Moscow when I was still there as Financial Times bureau chief, and then kind of ran the Financial Times in America, then went to Reuters, and then decided life was boring, so you became a politician and ran and won a seat, a riding in Toronto, and became foreign minister and trade minister and finance minister and deputy prime minister, and now is had enough of that for a while and is working on Ukraine. And one of the reasons it's so special for me is I have very strong memories. I was, in 2014, helping to cover the Maidan disturbances which led to the revolution, which led to today. And you came as a Canadian of Ukrainian heritage back to Ukraine to see the Maidan and support the people there. So it is, Chrystia, a great pleasure. And we will talk about Ukraine. And one thing I'm always amazed, since you're a strong Canadian, I always think that Vladimir Putin in some ways is responsible for creating a Ukrainian nationalism out of an Eastern Ukraine, a Russian Orthodox Ukraine, a Catholic Ukraine. And my dear leader, President Trump, has managed to create a Canadian nationalism by his discussion of having a 51st state. So that part must feel very odd.
Well, Steve, you say that kind of as a joke, but I think it is more true than you may realize. A very great Canadian Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, now has a line which he uses to great applause when he gives speeches in Canada. And he says, you know what? One day we are going to have to give President Trump the Order of Canada, which is the highest national honor, because he has reminded us of how proud we are to be Canadian, and he has united us as we maybe never before have been.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating. So, I mean, we will drop Canada for the minute and go to Ukraine. It's been going on a lot longer than a lot of people thought. I mean, I had friends American and Brits, who said, oh, Russia will invade, there's no question, but Ukraine will collapse in 3 days. And I had Russian friends, who I still talk to, who said, Putin's not that crazy, he won't invade, but if he invades, the Ukrainians will fight. And then French and German officials didn't want to hear about anything. They didn't want to talk about it at all. So in a way, everybody was wrong. So are we still wrong in what we think about what's going to happen? I mean, what's your sense of the situation there now? And I mean, let's start with that.
Yeah, look, I think, Steve, you're very smart to remind us how wrong all the smart people were about Ukraine. And, for sure, like, the West's smartest people were 100% convinced the day of the invasion that, Kyiv would last probably 3 weeks, 3 months at the outer limit. And Kyiv is still standing. So that's a really important starting point. I actually think that we are on the brink of another paradigm shift about Ukraine. And I think especially for Europe, I think that Europe is beginning to realize three things. One, Ukraine is going to win. I don't know in what form Ukraine is going to win, but this is a cohesive, resolute, determined society and economy, and they're not going to let themselves be wiped off the map. They are going to insist on being an economically and security viable country, whatever it takes. Second thing that I think is happening is I think Europe is starting to recognize that Ukraine isn't just some charity case, that the case for supporting Ukraine is not, only a moral case. And look, moral cases are good, but it's not just that. That Ukraine actually is a really important ally and economic partner for Europe. Ukraine really is Europe's shield. Europe needs Ukraine to be successful, and Ukraine is prepared to do that. I mean, think about the Russian threat to Europe. I think Europeans are more focused on that, perhaps, than they have been at any time since the Second World War. And guess what? There's one army in the world that today, even as we speak, is standing up to the Russian army, and that is the armed forces of Ukraine. And then the third thing, Steve, that I think is only starting to be recognized is the whole way of war has changed. And it has changed on the front lines of Ukraine, completely transformed. I think it's a transformation as significant in military terms as the transformations we saw in how we fight in the First World War and in the Second World War. And the thing about that transformation is it's really the rise of drone warfare, of AI warfare, of highly technological and much less expensive war. Right. And the remarkable thing is the Ukrainians are really good at it. And they're good at it not just at the front lines, but they're very good at inventing, manufacturing, and reinventing drones. And I think that's something which you are seeing NATO taking notice of. I don't know if you saw Zelensky is sending some Ukrainians to Denmark to support Denmark in drone warfare.
Well,
it's a complete shift in paradigm, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, Munich airport was shut overnight by unexplained drones. Who knows? No, and this, the EU turning somersaults over talking about a drone wall, whatever that is, on the eastern flank. I mean, it's an aspiration, but there are a lot of lessons, without question. And also, I mean, it is worth reminding people that certainly in the last 2 years of the war, Russia has gained less than 1% of Ukraine's territory. I mean, and in fact, it has a smaller footprint in Ukraine than it did at the height of its advance. So, but Ukraine also has issues, right? It has manpower problems, women power problems, it has money problems, it has a bit of morale problem. Can you talk about that too? Or, I mean, these are real, maybe they're not so important.
Of those three, I'll start with your last one, morale. I was in Ukraine about 2.5 weeks ago, and I had been hearing this also at a distance. I have to say my own sense was not that at all. My own sense is, look, the Ukrainians are really tired. The war is hard. I don't know anyone who is Ukrainian in Ukraine who hasn't been personally touched in some ways. This is a country truly at war. Everyone knows someone who has died. Everyone knows someone who has been wounded. That's terrible, actually. And Ukrainians are, I think, very realistic about the war and are prepared for it to go on.
Right.
So, there's no kind of, war euphoria.
Right.
There is tiredness, but
there's no collapse coming.
Well, because of the alternative. That's what I was struck by.
Right.
People, I asked people, I said, are you tired? Do you want to stop fighting? Are you depressed? And they would say, yeah, we would love to stop fighting. But we can't just stop fighting and go on holiday and end up living in Canada, right? To stop fighting means to lose our country. It means to be conquered. So the morale issue, I think, is, I have not seen that.
Right.
I think the issue of money is real. And, I really believe that if the issue of the assets of the Russian central bank, if Europe, because that is centrally a European issue, because the assets are principally in Europe, I'm very encouraged by the momentum that we're seeing in Europe, and I think Chancellor Merz in particular has really been very strong. If that issue could be resolved, then that is a path to resolving the financial issue for Ukraine.
No, it does. It solves some problems because most countries in Europe don't have very much fiscal space. They've got huge debts and they have obligations to spend on NATO, not just on Ukraine. So, I think they're trying, it's very hard because in a way, you can argue, and you're quite right, that Ukraine is fighting NATO's war against Russia, but NATO also has its own responsibilities and capability requirements, and can governments afford to pay for both at the same time? There have to be trade-offs. So what you're suggesting is, I've been one of these people that advocated seizing the assets anyway, because Russia has written them off. Russia doesn't expect to get them back. Central bankers get anxious about it, and people worry about the euro. But I take your point. The other thing, of course, that I wanted to ask you also about, because part of what the Ukrainians will say to me is, we can't give up because look at Bucha, look at Mariupol, look at what the Russians did when they conquered territory. It's not like they would take it over peacefully, right? So when
that Steve, is exactly the point, is what is the alternative? Right. That's what Ukrainians say. What's the alternative to winning?
But let me ask you Steve Witkoff went to Moscow and thought he was on the road to Damascus. I don't know. And he came back thinking he had the golden apple, which turned out to be brass or plastic. But this whole idea of trading part of the Donbass for some kind of peace settlement, I can see why people think that's absurd in Ukraine. But the idea of halting the war where it is, and at least making these front lines cold lines, not permanent lines, are people willing to sacrifice that much for the indefinite future of their territory, including Crimea, for an end to the war?
So look, I am Canadian.
Of course.
I don't speak for Ukraine or Ukrainians, and I think it is so important in thinking about how the war might end for Ukrainians to be the principal players. And let's remember, unlike a lot of other wars, the only people fighting on the Ukrainian side are Ukrainians. That's it. They haven't asked anybody else to show up, and no one else has. So that is 100% a question for Ukrainians. But what I will say, Steve, is I think we have to think pretty hard about what Russia is seeking to accomplish and what behaviors we expect from Russia after the war
Yeah,
ends.
please talk about that. I think that's
So,
important.
I think what we have to remember, and I think there's someone here who I spoke to yesterday who is Syrian. Yeah, Syrian Canadian. And, for Syrians, for Georgians, they know that this is not, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was not the beginning of Putin's aggression. Putin's aggression started in Georgia in 2008, and the response was weak. Then we had Syria, and the response was weak. Then we had Crimea, and the response was weak. The first real resistance that Putin has had to his revisionist approach to the post-World War II order has actually been since his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I think we need to take that seriously.
Yes.
And I think especially Europeans, but actually the whole world, needs to think about the end of this war as being a resolution that has to end Putin's aggression.
Right. Well, I was going to ask you, because obviously when we were both in Moscow, Putin was still in the background. I met him in '92 with Sobchak, and he was in a little office.
He was deputy mayor.
He was, and he was in a little office with Kudrin. You know? I mean, it's pretty amazing. But
Steve, he officiated at the wedding of some of my friends. How's that, right?
That's great. But the VV Putin we knew then, and the first time he's ever quoted in the New York Times is in an article I did about Sobchak. Someone pointed this out to me. I would love to find the notebook. I don't know where it is, for the whole interview. But, what's inside Putin's brain is a great mystery right now, I think. I don't think Western intelligence has a very good line on what he's really thinking. And the big question, and again, it's hypothetical, but you have a lot of West European officials, defense officials, NATO officials saying, whoa, if the war in Ukraine ends in the next 3 or 4 years, he's coming for us. Now, I'm not sure he's capable of that or wants to do that, but I don't know. What do you think?
I think it depends on how the war ends. I think that an end to the war, which includes the establishment of a secure, economically viable Ukraine, in strong partnership with Europe, that is an end to the war, which is also an end to Putin's aggression. And that sort of strategic vision about ending the war in a way where Ukraine can be Europe's shield, but also ending the war in a way that says to Putin, by the way, this was a bad idea. By the way, this didn't work. And I will say, ending the war in a way that says to all the other would-be invaders of sovereign states in the world, this doesn't work. That is really important because, the attempt by Putin to annex Ukraine, this is the gravest breach of what I think is the biggest accomplishment of the post-World War II order, which is we decided to stop eating each other. Right. And I think that it is so important to actually assert that it's not going to work. Yeah. You can't do that.
To assert and defend the integrity of post-war borders, which in fact Putin himself agreed to respect in 1994 in a treaty.
Russia did, exactly.
Yeah. And Putin was the Nachalnik then. So, this is why I ask. Canada's part of NATO. It's an important part of NATO. Should NATO be doing more for Ukraine? And if so, what might it best be doing? Are NATO leaders too afraid of pushing Russia into a corner? Are they afraid that Russia might lose the war?
As I said, Steve, I am by nature an optimist. That's why I became a politician. You have to have a degree of optimism to jump into the arena. You really do. And I am principally optimistic about Ukraine. And it's not just the determination, because it's one thing to decide you're going to win. It's another thing to have the social organization and the technological capacity to win. So that's my principal source of optimism. But I'm also optimistic that Western leaders, that European leaders, that the NATO alliance is seeing both Ukraine's strength and Ukraine's value in a new way.
Yeah. And also, I think, recognizing their own vulnerabilities.
That's Ukraine's value, right?
Yes.
Like that actually, that Ukraine is not, this is not a philanthropic effort, the support for Ukraine.
Right.
That supporting Ukraine is an investment in our own security.
Yes, and I must say, since 2022, having covered it, NATO now has troops on all 8 countries along the Russian flank, and the Germans have agreed to put in a whole brigade into Lithuania, so it's not like nothing's happening, but, you have a revisionist Russia, and good luck to Ukraine. We have run out of time, but I really want to thank you, Chrystia, so much. It's just such a pleasure to see you and have you here and discuss the bravery of Ukrainians. So please join me. And if I can also ask your indulgence to stay seated, we next have a case study panel on South Korea and its democracy, moderated by my colleague, Jyoti Thotam. So we will make the change. Thank you.